Saudi Arabia just made its first major oil sale to China in yuan instead of dollars. Most people missed it. But this quiet shift that started in 2023 is part of a pattern that has been building for 25 years. And if you understand what it means, you'll see why the global financial system is changing. Let me start with what the petrodollar system actually is, because there's a lot of confusion and misinformation about this. The petrodollar isn't a formal agreement. It's not a contract. It's not something that can expire on a specific date. It's a term that describes a practice that emerged in the 1970s, where oil-producing countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, primarily price and sell oil in US dollars. Here's the historical context. In 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. This created uncertainty about the dollar's value. But in 1974, the US established a security and economic partnership with Saudi Arabia. Part of this relationship involved Saudi Arabia continuing to price their oil in dollars. Other OPEC nations followed suit. Why did this matter? Because oil is the most traded commodity in the world. Every country needs it. And if oil is primarily priced in dollars, every country needs to hold dollars to buy oil. This created structural permanent demand for US currency. This demand had real benefits for the United States. It meant there was always a market for dollars. It meant the US could run larger deficits than might otherwise be sustainable. It gave the dollar a privileged position in global finance. This system has been in place for about 50 years. And for most of that time, it was relatively stable. Sure, there were fluctuations and challenges, but the basic pattern held: oil was traded in dollars. Now here's what's actually changing. And this is where we need to separate fact from fiction. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and China completed their first oil transaction settled in yuan instead of dollars. This was reported by multiple credible sources, including the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. It was a real event, not a rumor, not speculation. Actual oil, actually sold, actually paid for in Chinese currency. Now, does this mean the petrodollar is dead? No. Does it mean Saudi Arabia has stopped selling oil in dollars? Absolutely not. The vast majority of Saudi oil sales, probably 90% or more, are still conducted in dollars. But this yuan transaction represents something significant. It represents optionality. For the first time in decades, major oil producers are demonstrating that they can and will conduct sales in other currencies when it makes sense to do so. And Saudi Arabia isn't alone. Russia has been selling oil in rubles and yuan to China and India since Western sanctions made dollar transactions difficult. The UAE has done yuan-denominated oil deals. Iraq has discussed it. Iran already does it out of necessity since they're cut off from the dollar system. These aren't the majority of transactions, but they're happening, and they're increasing. So the accurate way to describe what's happening is this: the exclusive dominance of the dollar in oil markets is eroding. Not collapsing, not ending overnight, but eroding. Gradually, measurably. Now, let me show you the broader context, because the oil market is just one piece of a larger trend. According to the International Monetary Fund, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from about 71% in 1999 to about 58% in 2024. That is a 13 percentage point drop over 25 years. Is that dramatic? Not really. Is it significant? Yes. It shows a long-term trend of diversification away from dollar dominance. Where's that 13% going? Some of it went to the euro, which now represents about 20% of global reserves. Some went to other traditional currencies like the yen and pound. And increasingly, some is going to the Chinese yuan, which has grown from essentially 0% of reserves in 2000 to about 2.5% today. 2.5% doesn't sound like much. But in the context of global reserve currencies, it's significant growth. And the trajectory matters more than the current number. Central banks around the world have also been buying gold at the highest rates in decades. According to the World Gold Council, central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in 2022 and again in 2023. That's the highest level of buying since 1967. Why are they buying gold? Because gold is an asset that's not dependent on any single country's currency or economic policy. It's a diversification strategy. It's a hedge against currency risk. Now let's talk about China specifically. Because China is the driving force behind much of this shift. China is the world's largest importer of oil. They buy millions of barrels per day. For years, they had to use dollars for these purchases, which meant they needed to hold large dollar reserves. But China has been working systematically to change this. They've established currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing bilateral trade in local currencies. They've created the cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, which is an alternative to the dollar-based SWIFT system. They've been internationalizing the yuan through initiatives like the Belt and Road. These are facts. These are real programs that China has implemented over the past 15 years. You can verify all of this through official sources. The question is, why? Why is China doing this? The simple answer is that China wants to reduce its dependence on the dollar system. They've seen how the US has used dollar dominance as a geopolitical tool, sanctions, asset freezes, exclusion from SWIFT. China has watched what happened to Russia, to Iran, to Venezuela, and they've concluded that being dependent on the dollar system is a strategic vulnerability, so they're building alternatives. Not because the dollar is about to collapse, but because they want options. They want resilience, they want to reduce their exposure to US policy decisions, and they're not alone. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been discussing alternative financial arrangements for years. In 2023, they invited 6 more countries to join: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Argentina. These countries represent a significant portion of global GDP and population. Now, have the BRICS launched a new currency to replace the dollar? No. Have they created a fully functional alternative to the dollar system? No. But are they moving in that direction? The evidence suggests yes. At their 2023 summit, BRICS nations discussed increasing trade in local currencies. They talked about developing new payment systems. They explored the possibility of a commodity-backed currency, though no concrete plans were announced. These are early stages. These are discussions and pilot programs. But the direction is clear. Multiple countries are working to create alternatives to dollar dominance. So what does all of this actually mean? What are the real implications of these trends? Let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying the dollar is about to collapse. I'm not saying you should panic. I'm not saying America is doomed. Those are exaggerations that don't match the data. What I am saying is that the global monetary system is slowly shifting from a unipolar system, dominated by the dollar, to a multipolar system where several currencies play significant roles. This shift has implications, real, measurable implications that will affect the US economy and Americans' lives. But these implications will likely play out over years and decades, not weeks or months. Implication 1, the US will likely face more constraints on deficit spending over time. Right now, there's consistent global demand for treasury bonds because countries need dollar reserves. As that demand moderates, the US government may face higher borrowing costs. Not tomorrow, but gradually, over years. Higher government borrowing costs could mean higher interest rates throughout the economy. Higher interest rates affect mortgages, car loans, business investment. This doesn't cause an immediate crisis, but it does mean economic conditions could be more challenging than they've been during the eras of peak dollar dominance. Implication 2, the dollar may experience long-term depreciation relative to other major currencies. Again, not a collapse, not hyperinflation, but a gradual decline in value. This would make imports more expensive for Americans. It would reduce purchasing power over time. If you've noticed that foreign travel seems more expensive than it used to be, or that imported goods cost more, this is partly why. The dollar has already experienced some depreciation over the past few decades. This trend may continue. Implication 3, US geopolitical influence may decline. A significant portion of America's global influence comes from the dollar's central role in international finance. When we impose sanctions, they work because countries can't easily operate outside the dollar system. As alternatives develop, sanctions become less effective. Countries have more freedom to act independently of US preferences. This doesn't mean America becomes irrelevant. We're still the world's largest economy, a military superpower, a center of innovation. But the specific leverage that comes from dollar dominance will gradually diminish. Implication 4, American consumers may face higher inflation over the long term. The petrodollar system allowed the US to export some of our inflation to the rest of the world. As the system erodes, more of that inflation stays home. Combined with dollar depreciation, this could mean Americans experience higher prices for goods and services over time. Again, I'm not talking about hyperinflation or economic catastrophe. I'm talking about higher trend inflation, maybe 3 to 4% instead of 2%. That's meaningful over decades. It means your savings lose value faster. It means you need higher wage growth to maintain your standard of living. Now, let me address some important caveats and uncertainties, because honest analysis requires acknowledging what we don't know. We don't know how fast this transition will occur. The decline of the British pound as the reserve currency took several decades. The dollar's transition could be faster due to modern technology and communication, or it could be slower due to the depth of existing dollar-based systems. We don't know if this trend will continue linearly or if there will be reversals. Economic crises, geopolitical events, policy changes, these can all affect the trajectory. China could face economic problems that slow yuan internationalization. The US could implement policies that strengthen the dollar's position. We don't know what the end state looks like. Will we end up with a truly multipolar currency system where the dollar, yuan, and euro all play major roles? Will a new reserve currency emerge? Will we see a return to commodity-backed currencies? These are all possibilities, but we don't know which will materialize, and we don't know all the second and third order effects of this transition. Complex systems produce unexpected outcomes. There will likely be consequences we can't predict from where we sit today. So what should you make of all this? How should you think about these trends? First, understand that this is a long-term structural shift, not a short-term crisis. You don't need to make drastic immediate changes to your life or finances, but you should be aware of the trend and factor it into your long-term thinking. Second, recognize that diversification makes sense in a changing global system. This isn't financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor, but the general principle of not having all your eggs in one basket applies to currencies just like everything else. Understanding that the dollar's dominance is eroding might inform how you think about assets and exposure. Third, stay informed. The situation is evolving. New data comes out monthly. Policy changes happen. Geopolitical events occur. Following credible news sources and economic data will help you understand how things are developing. Fourth, be skeptical of extreme claims in either direction. You'll see people claiming the dollar is about to collapse or that dollar dominance will last forever. Neither extreme is supported by the data. The reality is more nuanced. The system is changing, but it's changing gradually. Fifth, understand that this affects different people differently. If you're young and building wealth, you have time to adapt to changing conditions. If you're retired and living on fixed income, currency fluctuations might affect you more directly. If you work in international trade or finance, you'll feel these shifts more than someone in a purely domestic industry. Now let me walk through some specific data points that illustrate these trends, because I want you to be able to verify what I'm telling you. According to SWIFT data, which tracks international payment messages, the dollar's share of global payments has declined from about 42% in 2015 to about 38% in 2024. Meanwhile, the yuan's share has grown from about 2% to about 4.5%. The euro has remained relatively stable at around 35%. These numbers fluctuate month to month, but the trend over the past decade is clear. The dollar is still dominant, but its dominance is decreasing. According to Bank for International Settlements data on foreign exchange trading, the dollar is involved in about 88% of all transactions. That sounds like overwhelming dominance, but in 2001, that number was 90%. Again, a small decline, but a decline nonetheless. According to U.S. Treasury data, foreign holdings of U.S. Treasury securities have grown in absolute terms. They're currently around $8 trillion, but they've declined as a percentage of total outstanding debt. Foreign holders owned about 34% of U.S. debt in 2011. Today, it's about 24%. This means the U.S. is increasingly borrowing from itself rather than from foreign countries. That's not necessarily bad, but it does indicate reduced foreign demand for dollar assets relative to the growth of U.S. debt. China's holdings of U.S. treasuries have declined from a peak of about $1.3 trillion in 2013 to about $800 billion today. Japan remains the largest foreign holder at around $1.1 trillion, but total foreign demand has not kept pace with the growth of U.S. debt issuance. According to Bank of International Settlements data, cross-border bank lending in yuan has increased from essentially zero in 2010 to over $1 trillion equivalent today. This shows real growth in yuan use for international finance. The Shanghai Oil and Natural Gas Exchange, launched in 2018, allows oil trading in yuan. While volume is still relatively small compared to traditional markets, it exists and is growing. This provides infrastructure for non-dollar oil trading. All of these data points come from official, credible sources: the IMF, BIS, World Bank, U.S. Treasury, SWIFT. You can look them up yourself. I'm not making these numbers up or exaggerating them. And when you look at all these data points together, a picture emerges. The dollar remains dominant. But that dominance is eroding measurably across multiple metrics over multiple years. Now let me talk about the historical context, because understanding how we got here helps understand where we might be going. The dollar became the global reserve currency after World War II at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The U.S. emerged from the war as the strongest economy with the most gold reserves. Tea made sense for the dollar to play a central role in the post-war economic order. From 1944 to 1971, the dollar was backed by gold. Countries could exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. This provided a nominal anchor for the system. In 1971, Nixon ended gold convertibility because the U.S. didn't have enough gold to back all the dollars in circulation. This could have ended dollar dominance, but the petrodollar system that emerged in the 1970s created a new source of dollar demand. Instead of being backed by gold, the dollar was backed by oil, or more precisely, by the need to hold dollars to buy oil. This system worked well for 50 years, but no monetary system lasts forever. The gold standard didn't last. The Bretton Woods system didn't last. The British pound's dominance didn't last. There's no reason to expect the petrodollar system to be permanent. What we're seeing now is the natural evolution of the global monetary system, not a crisis, not a conspiracy, just change. The kind of change that happens every few decades in international finance. The question isn't whether the system will change. The question is how fast and what replaces it. And that's where uncertainty comes in, because we're in the middle of the transition, not at the end. We can see the trends, but we can't see the final outcome. Let me address some common misconceptions I see people making about this topic. Misconception 1. China is trying to make the yuan the new global reserve currency. This is probably not accurate. China's capital controls and financial system opacity make the yuan unsuitable as a true reserve currency in the Western sense. What China wants is not yuan dominance, but yuan optionality. They want the yuan to be one of several major currencies, not the only one. Misconception 2. The end of dollar dominance means the end of American power. This is too simplistic. America has many sources of power: military, technological, cultural, institutional. Currency is one source of power, but not the only one. Britain lost pound dominance, but remained a significant global player for decades afterward. Misconception 3. This is all happening because of recent U.S. policy mistakes. While recent policies may have accelerated some trends, the underlying drivers are structural and have been building for decades. The rise of China's economy, the growth of emerging markets, technological changes enabling new payment systems. These would be happening regardless of specific policy choices. Misconception 4. There's nothing the U.S. can do to prevent this. That's also not quite right. Policy choices matter. Fiscal responsibility, maintaining economic growth, preserving the rule of law, keeping financial markets deep and liquid, these all support the dollar's role. The U.S. isn't powerless, but it also can't simply decree that the dollar will remain dominant forever. Now let me talk about the academic and expert perspective on this, because I'm not the only one noticing these trends. The IMF has published multiple papers on the decline of dollar dominance and the rise of alternative currencies. They track this data closely and have noted the trend toward a more multipolar currency system. The Bank for International Settlements, essentially the central bank for central banks, has also documented the growth of non-dollar payment systems and the diversification of reserve holdings. Economists like Barry Eichengreen at Berkeley have written extensively about reserve currency transitions. The academic literature supports the idea that we're in a gradual transition period. Even former Treasury officials and Federal Reserve economists have acknowledged these trends, though they often downplay the speed and significance. The point is, this isn't a fringe view. This is observable reality that credible institutions and experts recognize. Where there's disagreement is on the timeline and ultimate implications. Some experts think this transition will take 50 years and won't dramatically affect the U.S. Others think it could happen faster and have more severe consequences. But almost everyone agrees the direction is toward less dollar dominance, not more. Now, let me address what this means for understanding news and economic data going forward. When you hear about trade deals between countries that don't use dollars, that's part of this trend. When you hear about countries joining BRICS or establishing currency swap lines, that's part of this trend. When you hear about central banks buying gold, that's part of this trend. These aren't isolated incidents. They're all pieces of the same larger pattern. The global economy is slowly, gradually, measurably moving toward a system where the dollar is one important currency among several, rather than the overwhelmingly dominant currency. When the U.S. imposes sanctions and they seem less effective than they used to be, that's partly because targeted countries have more non-dollar options. When inflation seems persistent despite Fed actions, that's partly because some of the inflation pressure comes from structural changes in global currency demand. When interest rates seem higher than historical norms, that's partly because the U.S. faces more constraints on borrowing than during peak dollar dominance. All of these things connect to this underlying shift in the global monetary system. So what should you actually do with this information? I'm not going to give you specific financial advice because I'm not a financial advisor and I don't know your individual situation about this. Stay informed about global economic trends. Don't just focus on domestic news. Understand what's happening in China, in Europe, and emerging markets. The world is interconnected, and these connections matter. Think long term. These trends play out over years and decades. Don't make impulsive decisions based on short-term fluctuations, but do factor long-term trends into your planning. Understand that diversification is a sound principle in a changing system. This applies to investments, to skills, to income sources. Not putting all your eggs in one basket makes sense when the basket itself is evolving. Be skeptical of extreme claims. If someone is telling you to make drastic immediate changes based on imminent dollar collapse, they're probably exaggerating. If someone is telling you nothing is changing and the dollar will dominate forever, they're probably in denial. The truth is in the middle. Focus on fundamentals. Regardless of currency fluctuations, providing value, building skills, creating things people need, These remain important. The medium of exchange might evolve, but the fundamentals of creating and exchanging value don't change. Now let me address the question of timelines. When will we know if this transition is really happening? What are the markers to watch for? Watch BRICS developments. If they successfully launch a commodity-backed currency or a widely used alternative payment system, that would be a major milestone. It would accelerate the transition significantly. Watch oil market data. If the percentage of oil traded in non-dollar currencies grows from the current small percentage to 20 or 30%, that would be a significant shift. Track this through commodity market reports and trade data. Watch reserve currency composition. The IMF publishes this quarterly. If the dollar's share drops below 50% of global reserves, that would be a symbolic and practical milestone. Watch U.S. Treasury auctions. If the U.S. starts having difficulty selling bonds, if yields have to rise significantly to attract buyers, that indicates reduced foreign demand for dollar assets. Watch exchange rates. If the dollar experiences sustained depreciation against a basket of other currencies, that indicates reduced demand for dollars. Watch credit ratings. If U.S. sovereign debt is downgraded, that would signal concern about the sustainability of current fiscal policy and could accelerate the move away from the dollar. These are measurable, observable indicators. You don't have to speculate or guess. You can track this data and see for yourself how the transition is progressing. Based on current trends, my assessment is that we're still in the early stages of this transition. The dollar will likely remain the dominant currency for at least another decade, possibly longer, but its market share will continue to decline gradually. The critical period might come in the 2030s or 2040s, when the dollar's share of reserves and trade drops to the point where it is just one currency among equals rather than the dominant currency. But this timeline could accelerate or decelerate based on events we can't predict. The key point is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a trend, not an event. Let me also talk about what this means for understanding American economic policy debates. Debates about deficit spending, about debt levels, about trade policy, these all connect to the question of dollar dominance. The U.S. has been able to run larger deficits than might otherwise be sustainable, partly because of structural dollar demand. As that demand moderates, there may be more constraints on fiscal policy. This doesn't mean the U.S. needs to immediately balance its budget or that deficit spending is always bad. But it does mean that the U.S. may face more trade-offs and constraints in the future than it has in the past. Similarly, debates about manufacturing, about trade relationships, about supply chains, these all connect to the changing global economic order. A world where the dollar is less dominant is a world where the U.S. might need to be more competitive in producing goods rather than just providing currency. Understanding these connections helps you make sense of policy debates and economic news. Let me also address the emotional and psychological dimension of this topic. Because for many Americans, the idea that dollar dominance is declining can feel threatening or unsettling. The dollar has been dominant for our entire lives. It's easy to assume that's just how things are, that's permanent, that's natural. But monetary systems are human constructions. They evolve, they change, and that change is neither good nor bad. It just is. Different countries will experience this transition differently. For China, it represents growing influence. For the US, it represents adjustment. For many smaller countries, it might mean more options and less dependence on either the dollar or the yuan. Your personal experience will depend on your individual circumstances, your age, your wealth, your career, where you live, how internationally exposed you are. Some people will barely notice, others will feel significant effects. The important thing is to approach this rationally rather than emotionally. Don't panic, but don't be in denial either. Just stay informed and adapt as needed. I want to end by emphasizing what I've tried to do in this video. I've presented verifiable facts. I've shown you data from credible sources. I've acknowledged uncertainty where it exists. I've avoided making extreme predictions or fear-mongering claims. This is how we should talk about complex economic issues. Not with clickbait and exaggeration, but with honest analysis of real data. The petrodollar system is eroding. That's a fact supported by multiple data points. The dollar's global dominance is declining gradually. That's also a fact. These trends have real implications for the American economy and American lives, but these changes are playing out over years and decades, not days and weeks. There's time to understand them, time to adapt, time to prepare thoughtfully rather than panic. If you found this analysis useful, if you appreciate fact-based discussion of economic trends, subscribe to this channel. I'm committed to covering these topics honestly, using real data, acknowledging uncertainty, and avoiding the hype and exaggeration that's too common in financial media. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Do you see these trends in your own life or work? What questions do you have about the changing global monetary system? I read comments